Before the sun decides anything, the river decides everything. It lays a veil of silver over the low fields and breathes out a fine mist that clings to reed and sandal alike. A boy stands ankle-deep at the edge, holding a straight length of oak no longer than his arm. He is not yet the figure whose name will fill scrolls and tavern stories. He is simply a child with a stick and a stubborn willingness to try again. The breath clouds from his mouth in small, steady blooms. In the pause between each exhale, you can hear the rustle of watergrass and the deep, sleep-slow croak of a frog that does not know it is sharing a morning with a legend. His house sits back from the floodplain, on a patch of slightly higher earth, walls of wood darkened by smoke and time. It is a craftsman's house and a fighter's house, which is to say, there are few luxuries and many tools. On one wall hangs a pair of short iron truncheons, their simple curves promising restraint or ruin depending on the hand that holds them. Along a beam rests a long sword and its shorter companion, plain fittings polished by work rather than ornament. Nearby, a rack of staves leans like saplings taught to stand together. The smell inside is straw, ash, and the clean oil that keeps weather out of steel. The boy will take many names in his life. For now, he is simply the son of Shinmen Munisai, fighter, instructor, man of a temper that can flash like flint, and a discipline that cools just as quickly. In this house, the morning is for movement, before rice, before water hauled from the well, before the small chores that help a household stitch itself to the day, there is practice. The boy lifts the stick, bokken in the language of schools, and learns first how not to lift his shoulders with it. He learns that the body tries to help in the wrong places. He learns that correction is kindness when it comes quickly. He learns the first lesson of the sword, which is how to stand without leaning into the future or bracing against the past. Outside, crows hop along a boundary line as if inspecting it on behalf of the mountain. The boy follows the grain of his own breath until it stops sounding like work. A correction comes from behind him. Tilt of chin, width of stance, the suggestion to see more than the point in front of him. And he obeys without flinch or fuss. There will be days when he resists, as all children do, but not this morning. The stick moves as the river moves, not in a straight line alone, but with a sense of what lies around it. He cuts the air and listens to what it says back. Beyond this small world, the larger one is not at peace. The wars that have ground through generations are finally beginning to settle into new arrangements, but the habits of insecurity remain. Men still carry grievances like concealed knives. Villages still measure distance in hours rather than miles. A name can be a passport or a debt collector, sometimes both. In such a landscape, a boy's usefulness is counted in what he can do with his hands and how well he can control what those hands want to do. Munisai teaches him in a manner both exact and spare. The instruction is never wrapped in praise, nor is it delivered with cruelty. A posture is corrected, a cut is demonstrated. A failure is met with a request to repeat, and then to repeat again until the repetition irons itself into the body's fabric. When the boy sags, he is sent to the well to lift water, which is another way of practicing balance. When his focus drifts, he is told to rake the yard, which is another way of practicing attention. Stones to one side, leaves to the other, straight lines where there were no lines before. Everything is a lesson. Everything is also simply work. In the afternoons, when sunlight loosens the chill and the fields take on their quieter hum, the boy sits at the threshold and watches his father tend to tools. There is care in the way oil is applied, edge tested, scabbard checked. The lesson here is not about killing, but about stewardship. A neglected blade cuts its owner first. A forgotten strap fails when failure becomes a sentence. The boy learns that mastery is a household virtue long before it is a battlefield virtue. The rice pot must be mended properly. The fence must be tied well. A knot that loosens in rain will not spare you because your intentions were good. On certain days, men come to the yard who move like cats pretending to be farmers. They bow to Munise with the polite gravity of people who know exactly what they can do with their hands and prefer not to show it without need. They carry their own wooden swords, sometimes wrapped in cloth, as if to remind themselves that training is a promise, not a display. The boy watches them practice. There is a rhythm to their footwork that sounds like a poem without words. He counts their breaths without meaning to. He imagines the paths their cuts would take if the air were ink. Occasionally, one of these men speaks to the boy. The questions are always the same. Are you learning well? Do you listen? Can you hold a stance while someone tries to push you over? The boy nods. He can. They smile in the kind way that masks evaluation. The boy does not know it yet, but he is being entered into a quiet ledger kept by fighters everywhere. The list of those who might be worth testing later, worth teaching more carefully, worth watching, because something in the way they stand suggests a future. Evenings belong to the low lamp, to the sounds of insects and distant dogs, to the slow stitching of a day into a night that will hold it. The boy's hands are sometimes raw from the rough skin of the bokken. Ointment helps, but what helps more is the knowledge that rawness is a kind of map. Wherever it hurts is where the body is trying to grow. He eats simple food with appetite and falls asleep with the pleasant heaviness that follows honest fatigue. Dreams are a blur of river stick, his father's voice carrying a correction through the dim. He does not yet understand the larger structure in which his lessons sit. He cannot name the schools that trace their lineages like rivers back through centuries, or the etiquette that keeps sparring matches from turning into feuds. He has not stood in the polished floor of a city dojo and bowed with a dozen others while the master's feet made no sound. He does not know that the long sword on the wall will one day be carried slung through a sash rather than suspended from cords, reflecting a shift in how men move and fight. But he is learning the grammar of all of it without names, timing, distance, angle, presence. There are days when practice breaks into play. He and other village boys chase each other with rushes, fall laughing into ditches, argue over who was hit and who only felt the wind of a near miss. In such games, a first truth appears. The person who keeps his head when the group gets excited wins more often than not. He files that away somewhere he cannot yet find on purpose. Later, he will give it a name and call it strategy. For now, he only knows that when he breathes a little slower than everyone else, the game tilts in his favor. The seasons mark him. In winter, his breath turns silver and the wooden sword bites the palm, telling him where his grip is proud and where it is weak. In spring, the ground softens and shows him how to step without sinking or slipping. In summer, sweat teaches him the cost of stubbornness. He learns to do the work with less waste and more awareness. In autumn, the fields cut down to stubble remind him that sharpness is not a promise but a responsibility. The world is always instructing him, and he is learning how to listen with skin as much as with ears. Sometimes a story reaches even this quiet corner, carried by a peddler who knows how to turn a path into a stage. He hears of duels in temple courtyards of bandits routed by a single man whose calm made other men forget their plans of a lord's champion, who was beaten not by a better blade, but by a better mind. These accounts are embellished, of course. The laugh lines of the storyteller deepen with each telling. But beneath the embroidery lies a thread that he recognizes from his own body's lessons. Battles are lost before they start, when the heart runs ahead of the feet. Victories begin hours earlier, when a person chooses what to practice and what to abandon. He does not think of becoming undefeated. He does not think of becoming anything. He thinks of the satisfaction that comes when a cut travels the exact line he imagined it would, when the end of movement feels like the right answer to a question he asked 3 steps ago. He thinks of how, on a certain kind of morning, the air seems to meet the blade halfway. He thinks of how, when he is paying attention, he hears things he did not know made sound, the small hush of cloth before a foot lifts, the whisper of balance shifting from one leg to the other, the quick inhale someone takes when they are about to speak or strike. This, too, is training. Musashi, for all his sternness, sometimes sits with the boy and speaks of causes rather than results. He says that a strike is not an isolated event. It is the consequence of posture, intention, and proximity, and if any of those are wrong, the strike cannot be right. He says that a duel is not a contest between 2 swords, it is a contest between 2 kinds of attention. He says that a man who fears death every moment cannot walk down a road without stumbling, and that a man who has accepted death in his heart can look up and notice the hawk, which is another way of saying he can see opportunities that fear would hide. When the boy fails, and he does often, his father does not fan the failure into drama. He simply removes one variable. Do it slower, do it smaller, do it without the sword, do it only with the feet, do it only with the eyes. The boy learns a secret that many never learn at all. Difficulty is often a knot tied by too many strands. Loosen one, and the rest begin to yield. There is a day when the boy's hands find a coordination they have been circling for months. He takes the long practice sword in one hand and the short in the other and moves through the yard without a plan, letting his feet draw a path and his arms speak to each other. The result is clumsy in places and unexpectedly clean in others. He feels a tug toward this twin-handed language, a curiosity that will become the grammar of his mature style. He does not name it. He does not rush it. He simply notes the sensation of both sides of himself waking at once, like 2 eyes coming into focus on the same horizon. Night brings its own school. Lying on his mat, he replays the day's movements with the kind of attention that makes memory a second practice. Where was the balance lost? Where did the shoulder tighten? Why did that one step feel like stepping into mud, while the next felt like stepping onto stone? He discovers that the mind can tire the body without moving it, and that, if guided properly, this fatigue is a form of strengthening. He falls asleep in the middle of an imagined cut and wakes with the feeling that the body completed it on its own. Neighbors whisper that Musashi is hard on the boy. Others answer that the world will be harder. The boy hears neither argument from the inside. What he knows is that the discipline of his house is not cruelty. It is a way of reducing the number of surprises a day can hold. If he can rely on his stance, he has 1 fewer thing to fear. If he can rely on his breath, he has 2. If he can rely on his judgment about distance, he has 3. Fear shrinks when the list gets longer. On a rain-soaked afternoon, a traveler stops for shelter and, watching the boy practice beneath the eaves, asks a question that lands like a pebble in a still pond. Why do you practice so early before the day gives you anything to defend? The boy answers without thinking, because he has been listening to his father longer than he has been listening to himself. If you only practice when you must, you will move like someone being chased. If you practice when there is no chase, you will learn to move like someone who chooses. The traveler nods, as if a debt has been paid between strangers. The boy's world extends sometimes to a nearby temple, where old men sweep leaves into piles that will be burned at dusk, and young acolytes learn how to carry water without spilling it. He watches the way the monks bow, not too deep, not too fast, with a quality of attention that is its own form of strength. He does not yet know the words for emptiness that is not hollowness, for silence that is not absence. He only knows that in certain places the air teaches more than people do. Standing in a doorway, he feels for the first time the stillness out of which decisive movement can arise, the quiet at the heart of the blow. And always there is the river. In summer it lazes, in autumn it sharpens, in winter it grows stingy and then generous with thaw, in spring it carries branches and silt and rumours from upriver. The boy keeps returning to its edge with his wooden sword. He uses the waterline to mark his footwork, the current to test his balance, the reflections to study his posture from an angle his eyes cannot otherwise find. Sometimes he throws a leaf upstream and practices stepping so gently that the leaf seems not to move farther away. Sometimes he closes his eyes and listens for the difference between wind in reeds and wind on water and wind passing through the hollow of his own practice sword. He wants to know the world well enough to stop arguing with it. No one calls him great. No one calls him anything at all beyond his given name. He is a boy in a small place doing what his father puts before him. Yet the shape of a life can be seen if you step back far enough. Here is the daily appointment kept without excuse. Here is the tolerance for discomfort that expands a person's capacity rather than shrinking it. Here is the suspicion of ornament and the love of essentials. Here is the habit of noticing. Here is the beginning of a mind that will one day write, "Do nothing that is of no use." There will be a first public duel that startles grown men into silence. There will be a battlefield where banners fall into mud, and the young fighter understands what chaos means beyond poetry. There will be a school he invents because his hands insist on speaking with both voices at once. There will be an island and a wooden oar shaped into a lesson that arrives exactly on time. There will be painting and sculpture, a cave, and a set of maxims like river stones you can step on to cross a difficult stream. All of that lies ahead. For now there is a boy and a stick and a morning that does not know it has become history. He lowers the bokken and lets his arms fall to his sides. The mist has thinned to a faint gauze. Behind him, a door slides open. His father watches for a breath and then nods, almost imperceptibly. The nod is not praise. It is permission to continue. The boy brings the wooden sword back to guard and begins again, smaller, slower, sharper, folding the world into the few inches of wood that will have to be enough on every day that matters. The village road was nothing more than hard-packed dirt, marked by the tracks of ox carts and the prints of sandals. On certain mornings it felt ordinary, a path for farmers and merchants, but on one particular day it became the stage for a boy stepping into the wide, brutal theatre of history. Musashi was just 13, his body lean but already broad-shouldered, his spirit hardening in ways his age could not disguise. His opponent, Arima Kihei, was not just older, he was a trained swordsman from a respected school. Arima carried with him the pride of his lineage, the easy confidence of one who had won before. The villagers gathered in nervous clusters, unsure what they were about to witness. Surely this would be quick. Surely the boy would fall. Musashi stood barefoot in the dust, gripping a wooden sword. It was not a polished katana, not even a blade of steel, just a carved length of oak. Yet in his stillness there was something dangerous, something that unsettled those who had come expecting to see a child humiliated. His breath was even, his eyes fixed on Arima with a focus far beyond his years. When the duel began, there was no hesitation. Musashi lunged forward with a ferocity that startled even the seasoned warrior. He closed the distance before Arima could fully read his movement, swinging his bokken with the raw violence of a storm breaking over the ridge. The blow landed with a sickening force, staggering his opponent. Before the crowd could gasp, Musashi struck again, and again, his youthful strength driven by a mind that refused to allow doubt. Arima fell, beaten not by the sharpness of a blade but by the sharpness of resolve. The duel was over in moments, but for Musashi it was a lifetime, compressed into heartbeats. A line had been crossed. He was no longer just the son of a swordsman. He had announced himself to the world as someone who would not retreat, even against odds that reason would call impossible. The villagers stood in stunned silence. Some felt awe, others fear. What kind of boy carried such fury? What kind of future awaited someone who killed before his voice had fully deepened? Musashi himself said little. He did not linger to accept praise, nor did he dwell on what he had done. He walked away with the wooden sword still in his hand, its surface darkened by sweat and dust. That first duel was more than blood spilled on the road. It was a revelation. Skill mattered, but so did aggression. Confidence could crack under sudden, unrelenting force. Strategy could be born not from decades of study, but from clarity in the moment. Musashi had found his truth, one that would guide him across every battlefield and every duel to come. Victory was forged as much in the mind as in the blade. From that day forward, Musashi embraced the life of a ronin, a masterless samurai. For many, servitude to a lord meant safety, wealth, and reputation. But Musashi rejected such comforts. He was not bound by the rigid codes of the dojo, nor chained to the politics of the court. He chose the open road, wandering from village to village, mountain to mountain, seeking challenge and knowledge wherever he could find them. His possessions were few, his comforts fewer still. What he carried instead was an insatiable will to test himself against the best Japan could offer. This decision to walk alone was not without cost. Without a master, there was no guaranteed roof, no protection from stronger clans, no banner to shield him when the winds of war shifted. Yet this solitude became the forge of his philosophy. Alone, he had only himself to rely upon. Alone, he discovered that discipline and adaptability were not just virtues, but necessities. Every duel was training. Every defeat he avoided was proof that his path, however unorthodox, was the right one. The country he wandered was one of endless turmoil. The Sengoku period, an age when war was as common as rain, still cast its long shadow. Powerful clans rose and fell like waves, each vying for dominance. For samurai of the time, battle was not an occasional duty but a condition of existence. To survive was to fight. To thrive was to master not only the blade but the uncertainties of politics, famine, and betrayal. Musashi learned quickly that a duel was not always honorable. Opponents lied, ambushed, or conspired. He responded with tactics that others called unconventional, arriving late to unsettle an enemy, choosing ground that favored him, striking before the opponent's composure was complete. For him, a duel was never about ceremony. It was about survival, about reading the opponent's heart and breaking it before steel even touched steel. And so, in his teens and early 20s, he carved a reputation across the provinces of Japan. Each duel added a layer to his legend. Each opponent defeated reinforced the lesson he had first discovered on that dusty village road. The body can be trained, but the mind must be mastered. A man who fears death is already dead. A man who hesitates is already defeated. But war was never far. and Musashi's wandering soon carried him to one of the greatest battles in Japan history. The Battle of Sekigahara. The autumn of 1600 brought with it a battle so immense, so decisive, that it would reshape the fate of Japan for centuries to come. For Musashi, still a young warrior in his late teens, it was not merely another step in his journey. It was the crucible in which he would be tested against chaos on a scale far beyond anything a duel could teach. The Battle of Sekigahara was not a contest between two men, but between two visions of Japan. On one side stood the forces of Tokugawa Ieyasu, disciplined and shrewd, aiming to unify the fractured land under his rule. On the other, the Western army, led by Ishida Mitsunari, a coalition of lords desperate to preserve their own power and prevent Tokugawa's rising tide. When the armies finally converged on the fog-drenched fields of Sekigahara, they numbered over 160,000. Swords, spears, muskets, banners, and drums filled the valley, turning farmland into a storm of death. Musashi fought for the Western army. Why he chose that side is unclear. Some say it was loyalty to his father's connections, others that he simply found himself swept up in the currents of allegiance that carried so many ronin from one banner to another. What matters is that he was there, standing among tens of thousands, his armor still new, his spirit untested by the scale of such violence. The battle began before the sun had fully pierced the morning fog. Musket fire cracked through the mist, arrows arced overhead, and lines of men surged forward in waves. For Musashi, it was not like a duel where time slowed, where every detail of his opponent could be read. Here, there was only confusion, shouts in every direction, allies falling beside him, the thunder of hooves as cavalry swept in and out of view. Blood pooled in the mud, the stench of iron and earth mixing into something that would haunt his memory. He swung his sword again and again, striking not for honor, but for survival. In the press of bodies, technique gave way to instinct. He dodged clumsy spears, cut down enemies who stumbled too close, and drove forward with the stubborn resolve of one who refused to die. Around him men cried out, some for victory, many for their mothers. The sound of war was not the disciplined silence of a duel. It was chaos given form. And yet within that storm, Musashi learned something vital. He learned that the battlefield was not a place where beauty or form mattered. It was a place where adaptability and ruthless focus determined who lived and who did not. His strikes became shorter, sharper, economical. He no longer sought to overwhelm with flourish, he sought only to endure. This too would become part of his philosophy, efficiency over elegance, clarity over showmanship. The Western army faltered as betrayal tore through its ranks. Daimyo, who had sworn loyalty to Ishida Mitsunari, shifted their allegiance mid-battle, joining Tokugawa's side and turning the tide. What had begun as a clash of equals became a rout. Musashi found himself fighting not in victory, but in retreat. Surrounded on all sides, the Western army broke apart, samurai scattering across the valley, hunted by Tokugawa's advancing men. Somewhere in that collapse, Musashi slipped away. Accounts differ. Some say he hacked his way out, others that he vanished into the fog with nothing but his sword. However it happened, he survived when so many did not. Sekigahara ended with Tokugawa's decisive triumph, and from that day forward, the Tokugawa shogunate would dominate Japan for more than 2 centuries. For Musashi, the experience was transformative. He had stood at the heart of one of history's great battles and emerged alive, though without glory. He had seen not the elegance of single combat, but the horror of mass slaughter. He had learned that loyalty to great lords was fragile, that promises of honor often dissolved when power shifted. Above all, he learned that survival itself was victory, and that to endure was to triumph, even in defeat. The battle also deepened his commitment to the path of the ronin. While many survivors sought new masters in the wake of Tokugawa's rise, Musashi refused. He did not bend knee to Ieyasu, nor did he cling to the fallen lords of the West. Instead, he returned to wandering, determined to perfect his own style, free from the constraints of politics and allegiance. In the years that followed, Musashi sought duels across Japan. He walked into towns with little more than a wooden sword at his side and left behind whispers of yet another victory. His approach evolved with each encounter. Where others trained for decades under a single master, repeating the same kata, Musashi treated each duel as a laboratory of the battlefield. He tested timing, distance, intimidation. He discovered that by arriving late to a duel, he could unnerve his opponent, throwing them into frustration before the first strike. He experimented with weapons, sometimes fighting with a long sword, sometimes with two, sometimes with a staff. Always he adapted, and always he won. Word spread quickly. By his late 20s, Musashi was already a legend, undefeated in dozens of contests. Yet each victory carried more than just reputation. It carried lessons. He was beginning to see that the true enemy was never the man before him, but the fear, doubt, and hesitation within. To conquer himself was to conquer all. And yet, even as his fame grew, Japan itself was changing. The age of great wars was waning. With Tokugawa firmly in control, the country was inching toward peace, and opportunities for glory on the battlefield were fading. For a ronin like Musashi, this meant that the duel would remain his primary theater, the proving ground for both skill and philosophy. It was in this period that he would face the most formidable opponent of his career, the man whose name would forever be linked with his own, Sasaki Kojiro. The years following Sekigahara carried Miyamoto Musashi along a path of wandering duels, self-discovery, and growing reputation. By the time he approached 30 years of age, his name was already spoken with awe in every province he visited. He was undefeated in dozens of challenges, sometimes facing multiple opponents in a single day, always walking away alive while others fell. Yet one encounter would eclipse them all, defining his legend for centuries to come, his duel with Sasaki Kojiro. Kojiro was no ordinary opponent. He was the pride of the Hosokawa clan, a master swordsman with a flawless reputation of his own. Tall, elegant, and supremely confident, Kojiro was celebrated for both his skill and his style. His weapon was the nodachi, a great sword nearly as tall as a man, and with it he had perfected a technique known as the swallow cut. This strike, so fast and precise, was said to imitate the diving arc of a swallow in flight, slicing an opponent in a single, fluid motion. To face Kojiro was to face a storm honed into a single stroke. Musashi, by contrast, was anything but elegant. He was rough in manner, often unkempt, his hair wild, his clothing plain. He carried no banner, no lord's insignia, no formal school behind his name. To the refined elite, he seemed like a barbarian. But beneath that exterior was a mind sharper than any blade, a strategist who saw beyond technique to the very psychology of combat. Where Kojiro embodied polish and perfection, Musashi embodied adaptability and unpredictability. Their clash was more than two swords meeting. It was a collision of philosophies. The duel was arranged for Ganryu Island in the spring of 1612. Word spread quickly, drawing spectators from across the region. Fishermen, peasants, and samurai alike gathered on the shores to witness what was being called the ultimate contest of the age. For them, this was not just a fight, but a spectacle, a test of whose way of the sword would prevail. Musashi, ever the tactician, understood that victory was not secured only by the blade. It began long before the first strike. He chose to wage war on Kojiro's mind. While Kojiro arrived early, immaculate in his dress, his long sword gleaming in the sunlight, Musashi deliberately kept him waiting. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, the crowd murmured, and Kojiro's patience began to fray. Anger, Musashi knew, was a weapon he could use. At last, Musashi appeared, rowing himself across the water in a small boat. His hair was disheveled, his clothing plain. In his hands he carried not a katana, but a wooden sword he had carved from an oar during the crossing. To many onlookers it seemed disrespectful, even reckless, but Musashi had planned this. His makeshift weapon was slightly longer than Kojiro's nodachi, granting him the reach advantage that would prove decisive. Kojiro, insulted by the sight, flung aside his scabbard, declaring he would never need it again. The gesture was bold, but it betrayed his state of mind, anger clouded with pride. Musashi stepped onto the beach calm, his eyes steady. He knew the fight was already half won. The two men faced each other in silence. The air was heavy with tension, the crowd hushed. Then, in a sudden burst, Kojiro unleashed his famed swallow cut, the blade whistling downward with lethal speed. But Musashi was ready. With perfect timing, he stepped aside and swung his longer wooden sword in a single, devastating arc. The blow landed squarely on Kojiro's head, shattering bone. The great swordsman collapsed to the sand, lifeless before the crowd could even gasp. The duel was over in an instant. Kojiro, the polished master, had fallen to Musashi's unorthodox brilliance. Victory had not come through superior technique alone, but through strategy, through control of time, place, and psychology. Musashi had won the fight before it began. The death of Sasaki Kojiro echoed across Japan. To some it was a tragic end for a beloved swordsman. To others, it was proof of Musashi's unparalleled genius. But for Musashi himself, it marked a turning point. He had faced and defeated the strongest challenger of his age, yet instead of glory, he felt the weight of what it meant. He had nothing left to prove. In the years that followed, Musashi gradually withdrew from dueling. He still fought when challenged, but less frequently. His focus shifted from defeating others to conquering himself. He began to see that the path of the sword was not about endless contests, but about mastery of the spirit. To fight and kill was one way of learning, but to create, to reflect, and to understand, that was the higher way. From this period onward, Musashi's life entered a new phase. He painted, sculpted, and wrote. He studied strategy not as a swordsman alone, but as a philosopher, seeking truths that extended beyond combat. The duel at Ganryu Island had given him the ultimate victory and reputation, but it had also pushed him toward the realization that the greatest battles were no longer against men with swords, but against the weaknesses within his own heart. The question remained. In the aftermath of Ganryu Island, Miyamoto Musashi's name spread like fire across Japan. Everywhere he went, people whispered of the man who had slain Sasaki Kojiro with nothing but a wooden oar carved into a sword. For many, he had achieved the pinnacle of martial glory, the supreme swordsman of his age. Yet Musashi himself did not rest on that reputation. He turned inward. Having defeated his greatest rival, he realized that the path of mastery was not about triumphing over others, it was about transcending oneself. He began to distance himself from the cycle of duels that had defined his youth. No longer did he seek out every challenger, nor did he crave the recognition of the warrior class. Instead, he wandered. He spent months, sometimes years, living in solitude, moving between mountains, remote villages, and quiet temples. In these retreats, he exchanged the clamor of steel for the quiet scratch of brush on paper and the steady rhythm of chisel against wood. For Musashi, art was not a diversion but another expression of strategy. He believed that the same principles guiding the stroke of a sword applied to the stroke of a brush. The same clarity of mind needed in combat was required in painting a landscape, carving a sculpture, or writing a verse of poetry. To him, mastery was one path expressed through many forms. He painted birds in flight, their wings captured with simple, powerful strokes. He carved wooden statues of deities, not as ornaments for worship, but as exercises in focus and form. His calligraphy became known for its boldness, letters that carried the same authority as his strikes in battle. Each artwork was more than beauty. It was training, discipline, made visible. Yet even in his artistic pursuits, Musashi never abandoned the way of the warrior. He continued to train relentlessly, rising before dawn to practice with his twin swords, refining his Niten Ichi-ryū, the two heavens as one style that allowed simultaneous use of katana and wakizashi. He believed a warrior should never grow complacent, even in peace. Discipline was not a matter of convenience, it was a way of living. During this period, Musashi also began to attract followers. Younger samurai and curious disciples sought him out, drawn by his legend and hungry for instruction. Many expected to be taught secret sword techniques or invincible stances. Instead, they found a teacher who spoke of observation, rhythm, and state of mind. Musashi emphasized awareness above all, to read an opponent's spirit, to sense the flow of battle, to act without hesitation. He told them that a true swordsman did not merely wield a weapon, he wielded himself. He also warned them against the dangers of pride. He often pointed to Kojiro's fate as a lesson. Skill alone was not enough. Rigidity of ego could destroy even the most brilliant warrior. Adaptability, humility, and clarity of purpose mattered more than reputation or technique. In this way, Musashi's teachings reflected a profound philosophy, as much about life as about combat. As the years passed, his reputation shifted. He was no longer seen only as a duelist, but as a thinker, a strategist, even a philosopher. His contemporaries came to respect him not merely for his victories, but for his insight into the very nature of mastery. Daimyo and lords invited him to their courts, not always to fight, but to advise, to teach, and to share his perspective on leadership and strategy. Still, Musashi remained a wanderer at heart. He never bound himself permanently to one lord or clan, choosing instead to retain the independence of a ronin. Wealth, titles, and power held no appeal for him. What he sought was truth. The truth hidden behind the clash of swords, the truth revealed in silence after the brushstroke, the truth of what it meant to live without fear or attachment. By the 1630s, as his hair began to grey and the lines of age appeared on his face, Musashi settled more often in the company of students. He began to record his teachings in writing, distilling decades of experience into words that could endure beyond his life. This process would culminate in his most enduring legacy, a small but powerful text that combined the wisdom of the battlefield with the depth of philosophy, the Book of Five Rings. But before Musashi wrote his masterpiece, he endured one more transformation, one that took him even deeper into the meaning of strategy and life. He began to consider that the true battlefield was not found in the clash of armies or the dueling ground, but within the human mind. It was here, in this turning of his spirit toward the inner world, that Musashi began to step beyond the limits of his own legend. In the later years of his life, when the dust of his duels had long settled and the glory of victory no longer stirred his spirit, Miyamoto Musashi retreated into contemplation. He had wandered the length of Japan, defeated countless opponents, and lived a life of hardship, discipline, and solitude. Now, as his body began to slow but his mind remained sharp, he sought to leave behind a distillation of everything he had learned. That distillation became one of the most profound works of strategy ever written. The Book of Five Rings. Written in 1645 in the quiet seclusion of a cave near Kumamoto, Musashi's treatise was not composed for vanity. It was not written to impress the lords of Japan or to polish his legacy. It was a manual for truth, a guide for those who wished to understand strategy, not as a set of techniques, but as a way of being. In just a few short scrolls, Musashi condensed a lifetime of combat, observation, and philosophy into 5 elements: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. Each element was more than a metaphor. It was a pathway to mastery. Musashi began with the ground beneath one's feet, the fundamentals, the unshakable foundation. Earth, he wrote, was about principles, the roots of skill and character. Just as a house must stand on firm soil, so too must a warrior or an artist stand on the basics. He insisted that mastery of fundamentals outweighed the pursuit of clever tricks or shortcuts. A swordsman who did not grasp balance, timing, and rhythm could never hope to triumph, no matter how flashy his style. This principle extended beyond the battlefield. Musashi argued that in life, all excellence grows from simple, repeated practice. The Earth Book warned against neglecting the small, essential habits: discipline in training, clarity in thought, moderation in living. Those who built their lives on shallow ground, he warned, would crumble when tested. If Earth was the solid ground, water was its opposite: fluid, adaptable, and ever-changing. Musashi used water to describe the mindset a warrior must carry into battle. Like a stream, one must flow around obstacles, take the shape of circumstance, and shift without resistance. Rigid fighters, he observed, broke under pressure just as a tree snaps in the wind, while reeds bend and survive. Musashi urged his students to study their opponents, to read the flow of battle, and to never cling too tightly to a single form or technique. Victory belonged to those who could adapt. In life, this lesson resonated just as strongly. Musashi warned against dogma and pride. To think that one way, whether in combat, business, or art, was the only way, was to invite ruin. True strength lay in versatility, in the ability to learn from others, and in the willingness to change. Fire was intensity, the heat of conflict, the ferocity of the moment when steel met steel. In this book, Musashi taught about aggression, timing, and the seizing of initiative. Fire was not merely physical ferocity, but also psychological dominance. He believed that hesitation was the root of defeat. To win, one must ignite with purpose, strike decisively, and overwhelm the enemy before he could find his footing. But fire was also danger. A warrior consumed by his own flames could burn out. Musashi urged controlled aggression, the fire that consumes an opponent but does not consume oneself. He saw combat as rhythm, like the beat of a drum. Sometimes one must surge with ferocity, at other times withdraw and prepare, but always with timing sharp as a blade's edge. Applied to daily life, fire was the courage to act, to make decisions without paralysis, to throw oneself fully into the pursuit of purpose. It was about knowing when to push, when to risk, when to seize the fleeting chance before it disappeared. Wind represented perspective, the knowledge of other schools, other ways, and other minds. Musashi, though self-taught in many respects, studied the styles of rival schools carefully. He knew their strengths and their weaknesses, not to imitate, but to understand. He warned against arrogance, the belief that one's own way was superior by default. A true strategist must study the enemy's rhythm, the currents of their thought, the winds that shape their choices. To defeat another, one must first see the world through his eyes. But wind was also humility. Musashi encouraged his students to learn broadly, not only from martial arts, but from art, from nature, from conversation, from observation of life itself. Knowledge was not limited to the sword. From one thing, he wrote, know 10,000 things. Finally, Musashi arrived at the most mysterious of the five, void, where earth was firm, water adaptable, fire fierce, and wind perceptive. Void was the realm beyond all form. It was the state of no mind, mushin, a condition in which thought and action were one. In void, the strategist moved without hesitation, free from distraction, fear, or attachment. It was not emptiness, but clarity. To reach it, one had to master the other elements, so that instinct, honed by discipline, replaced conscious thought. In this state, the swordsman's blade moved as naturally as breath. Musashi believed void was not only the highest state of combat, but the highest state of living. To live in void was to live without clinging, to act with presence, and to let one's spirit align with the rhythm of the world. It was, in essence, enlightenment through strategy. The Book of Five Rings was concise, but its lessons carried weight far beyond the dojo. Business leaders, generals, artists, and thinkers for centuries have drawn from its pages. For Musashi, it was not a manual of swordsmanship alone. It was a guide to life, discipline, and purpose. Having completed this work, Musashi sealed his legacy as not only the greatest duelist of his age, but also as a philosopher of timeless relevance. Yet his writings did not end there. Alongside his famous treatise, he composed another work, one even more personal, and stripped of ornament, the Dokkōdō, the way of walking alone. In it, he revealed the deepest convictions of his heart. Would you like me to continue into part 7, where I expand on the Dokkōdō, its 21 principles, its personal wisdom, and how Musashi's final teachings moved beyond the sword into a philosophy for life? In the final year of his life, Miyamoto Musashi retreated into the quiet solitude of a cave near Kumamoto, a place where stone walls whispered of timeless stillness. His body was frail from illness, but his mind remained razor-sharp, forged by decades of conflict and contemplation. It was here, facing the inevitability of death, that he turned inward and distilled his philosophy into its purest form. This was the Dokkōdō, the way of walking alone. Unlike the Book of Five Rings, which was written as a guide for warriors and strategists, the Dokkōdō was deeply personal. It was not a manual for combat or politics. It was a set of 21 principles, stripped bare of flourish, each one a reflection of Musashi's understanding of life itself. These were not rules for others to follow blindly. They were the truths he had lived by, tested against hardship, solitude, and mortality. The first principle was simple, yet profound: accept everything just the way it is. To Musashi, this was the essence of peace. A man cannot control the world, but he can control how he sees it. Instead of raging against what cannot be changed, he urged acceptance, a calm surrender to reality. This was not weakness, but strength. Acceptance allowed him to act with clarity, free from the bitterness of complaint. In his life, he had seen too many warriors consumed by anger at fate, undone not by their enemies, but by their refusal to accept the present. He then declared, "Do not seek pleasure for its own sake." For Musashi, indulgence dulled the edge of spirit. Pleasure was fleeting, a distraction that led to weakness. He had chosen the life of a ronin, a masterless wanderer, not because it was comfortable, but because comfort was dangerous. To grow, one must endure hardship, resist temptation, and sharpen the will through struggle. His words cut to the heart of a lesson that still resonates. When life is too easy, the spirit decays. Another principle warned, do not under any circumstances depend on a partial feeling. Musashi urged discipline over impulse, reason over whim. In battle, hesitation was fatal. In life, decisions made on shallow feelings often led to ruin. He advised to anchor actions not in fleeting emotions but in deep conviction. One of his most striking teachings was humility. Think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world. Musashi, though undefeated in over 60 duels, did not believe in self-importance. Ego blinded warriors, making them arrogant, predictable, and vulnerable. To think lightly of oneself was to remain humble, open to learning. To think deeply of the world was to cultivate awareness, to see beyond one's narrow desires and into the larger rhythm of life. He continued, "Be detached from desire your whole life long." Desire, in Musashi's eyes, was the root of suffering. To cling to wealth, status, or even relationships was to give away one's freedom. As a ronin, he lived unattached, no master, no permanent home, no possessions beyond what he could carry. Detachment did not mean lovelessness or apathy. It meant refusing to be enslaved by what could be taken away. Freedom was found not in having, but in being. Equally powerful was his counsel. Do not regret what you have done. Musashi had seen men haunted by past failures, paralyzed by shame, but regret, he believed, was wasted energy. Every choice, every action, even mistakes, shaped the warrior into who he was. To regret was to fight battles already lost. Better to learn, adapt, and move forward without hesitation. He warned against jealousy, for envy was poison to the soul. He cautioned against sorrow over separation, reminding his followers that all things are impermanent, companions, victories, even life itself. To cling was to suffer, to let go was to be free. One principle struck especially deep. Do not let yourself be guided by the feeling of lust or love. For Musashi, emotions were powerful forces that could cloud judgment. Love and desire could lead men astray, binding them to attachments that weakened their discipline. He was not cold-hearted, but realistic. A warrior who surrendered to passion became predictable, vulnerable to manipulation. To master the self meant to master even the heart. He urged indifference to where one lived, to food, to customs, to status. To him, the external conditions of life mattered little compared to the inner condition of the spirit. He wrote, "Do not pursue the taste of good food." For Musashi, indulgence in delicacies was another chain that bound men to weakness. Sustenance should serve the body, not enslave it. He spoke of anger. Do not hold on to resentment. Anger lingered like poison, turning strength into self-destruction. Forgiveness was not weakness, but liberation. He warned against placing oneself above others, against pride and arrogance. He reminded that all positions, titles, ranks, honors, were temporary. What endured was character, not position. Perhaps the most profound principle was his counsel regarding life itself. Do not be preoccupied with living a long life. To Musashi, fear of death was the greatest weakness. All men die, but not all live with freedom. He had walked into every duel ready to die, and in doing so found true fearlessness. A man consumed with the preservation of life was already defeated. A man who accepted death could live fully, without hesitation. Finally, his last principle gathered them all: do not stray from the way. The way, as Musashi understood it, was not just swordsmanship. It was the pursuit of truth, of discipline, of harmony with the world. To stray was to lose oneself to distraction, indulgence, and weakness. To remain on the way was to walk with purpose, clarity, and freedom. The Dokkōdō was stark, almost harsh in its simplicity, but its power lay in that very austerity. It was the philosophy of a man who had stripped life to its essence, who had lived without compromise, and who now faced death with serenity. These 21 principles were Musashi's final gift. He had nothing more to prove. He had no need for victory, fame, or wealth. He had walked the path of mastery alone, and in solitude he found its end. The cave where he wrote his last words became a symbol, not of retreat, but of transcendence. In his way of walking alone, Musashi revealed the ultimate truth he had discovered. The greatest battle is not fought against others, but against the self. And the true warrior, the true master, is the one who conquers his own weakness, desire, and fear. By the spring of 1645, Miyamoto Musashi was near the end of his path. His body, worn from decades of combat and relentless training, could no longer keep pace with the sharpness of his mind. Yet even in frailty, his presence commanded respect. To the warriors of Japan, he was no longer just a swordsman. He was a living legend, a man whose very name carried the weight of countless victories and timeless wisdom. It was during these final days in the quiet recess of the cave, where he had written both the Book of Five Rings and the Dokkōdō, that Musashi prepared himself for death as he had prepared for every duel, with clarity, composure, and acceptance. He shaved his head, donned his best robes, and seated himself upright, sword at his side, as though ready to face one last opponent. For him, death was not a defeat. It was simply the next step in the way. When word spread of his passing, grief rippled across Japan. Warriors who had once dreamed of testing themselves against him mourned the loss of a rival they would never face. Lords who had heard of his genius in battle recognized that they had lost not merely a fighter, but a strategist of rare brilliance. Disciples who had trained under him remembered not just his technique, but his discipline and his demand for integrity. His burial was conducted with honor. He was laid to rest at the foot of Mount Iwato, near the cave that had sheltered his final reflections. The cave itself became a site of pilgrimage, a place where warriors, monks, and poets alike came to meditate upon the lessons of the man who had walked both the path of the sword and the path of wisdom. But Musashi's death was not the end of his influence. In fact, it marked the beginning of a legacy that would transcend time, carrying his teachings far beyond the world of the samurai. His Book of Five Rings became one of the most enduring works of strategy ever written, studied not only by warriors, but by generals, merchants, artists, and eventually business leaders centuries later. The principles of earth, water, fire, wind, and void were applied to challenges far beyond the battlefield, shaping negotiations, guiding creativity, and inspiring discipline in those who sought mastery in any field. In the centuries that followed, Musashi was celebrated as Kensei, the sword saint. Few in Japanese history were ever given such a title. It was not only his unmatched record of 61 undefeated duels that earned him this honor, but his philosophy of life, which reached beyond combat. He had shown that the true path of the warrior was not endless violence, but a journey inward towards self-control and enlightenment. Artists found inspiration in him as well. His ink paintings, spare and fluid, revealed the same discipline he brought to the sword. Simple brushstrokes carried the weight of years of contemplation, proving his belief that mastery in one art could illuminate mastery in all others. Philosophers admired his rejection of luxury, his insistence on simplicity, and his commitment to walking the path alone, if necessary. And as Japan moved from centuries of war into the relative peace of the Tokugawa era, Musashi's teachings became more relevant than ever. In a world where the sword was no longer the sole measure of a samurai, his philosophy of adaptability, detachment, and discipline offered guidance to those seeking meaning in quieter times. Even today, his words echo. Soldiers study his strategies. Entrepreneurs look to his lessons for clarity in competition. Artists embrace his idea that mastery in one discipline reveals truths about all. Everyday people find in his Dokkōdō a reminder to live simply, detach from distractions, and walk a path of purpose. Musashi's life was proof of a profound truth. The sharpest blade is not held in the hand, but forged in the mind. His victories in duels were legendary, but his greatest triumph was conquering fear, desire, and ego. In this way, he remains undefeated, not because no man could strike him down, but because no force could shake his resolve. His legacy endures as both a warrior and a philosopher, as the greatest swordsman of Japan, and as a guide to those who seek mastery in their own lives. He showed that the way is not about perfection, nor about victory over others, but about victory over oneself. And so the story of Miyamoto Musashi closes where it began, in the stillness of discipline, in the solitude of the path, in the unbroken commitment to live and to die by the way. He walked alone, yet his footsteps echo endlessly, guiding all who seek mastery, not of the sword, but of the self. Centuries have passed since Miyamoto Musashi last walked the earth, yet his voice has never faded. His words, carried in the Book of Five Rings and the Dokkōdō, speak with startling clarity to challenges that did not even exist in his time. Though he wrote in the age of swords and samurai, his philosophy reaches into our modern world, a world not of duels and battlefields, but of deadlines, distractions, ambitions, and struggles of the mind. Musashi believed discipline was the foundation of all mastery. In the 17th century, this meant waking before dawn, training with blades, and denying himself luxury. In our world, it can mean something different but no less demanding. It might be rising early to write, to exercise, or to study before the day's chaos begins. It might mean resisting the endless pull of screens, notifications, and the comforts of convenience. Just as Musashi warned against wasting time on what is of no use, today we face 1,000 digital temptations designed to scatter our focus. His message is unchanged. If you cannot govern your attention, you cannot govern your life. He taught that fear is the great enemy of action. Musashi entered each duel prepared to die, not because he sought death, but because he refused to be ruled by fear. In the 21st century, our fears may look different, but they are no less paralyzing. Fear of failure, of rejection, of stepping beyond the familiar. Musashi's advice rings clear: face them directly. The project you hesitate to begin, the words you are afraid to speak, the risks you avoid, all are today's battlefields. To accept discomfort, to step forward despite uncertainty, is to live by Musashi's way. Musashi also taught detachment. To him, possessions, status, even relationships could become chains if clung to too tightly. In our consumer-driven world, this lesson is urgent. Many people define themselves by what they own, by how many likes they receive, by the validation of others. Musashi's life reminds us that freedom lies in simplicity. Owning fewer things, caring less for empty approval, and focusing on what is essential can bring a strength that luxury never will. He showed that power comes not from grasping, but from letting go. His reflections on adaptability are just as vital today. He believed a warrior must flow like water, able to change rhythm, stance, and strategy in the blink of an eye. For us, adaptability means adjusting when careers shift, when technology transforms the way we live, or when life delivers the unexpected. Those who cling too rigidly to one way of thinking, one definition of themselves, risk breaking. Those who adapt, as Musashi taught, endure. Even the idea of mastery itself carries a modern lesson. Musashi saw mastery as a path with no final destination, a lifelong process of refinement. In an age where many chase quick results and shortcuts, his perspective is a sobering reminder. True mastery, whether in business, art, sports, or personal growth, is built in years, not moments. Progress may be invisible day to day, but the path is walked in small steps, repeated endlessly until skill becomes second nature and effort becomes identity. Perhaps Musashi's most powerful gift to modern life is his belief that the greatest battle is always within. We may no longer face duels at dawn, but we duel daily with self-doubt, with procrastination, with distraction and fear. These are our opponents, and Musashi has already given us the weapons to face them: discipline, clarity, adaptability, detachment, and persistence. Picture the modern professional overwhelmed by endless tasks. Musashi would advise them to cut away what is useless and focus only on what matters. Imagine the young artist afraid to share their work. He would remind them that hesitation is death and that courage must come before recognition. Consider the athlete, the student, the entrepreneur, all standing before challenges that feel insurmountable. Musashi would tell them the same truth he lived by: the way is in training. Do the work today, and tomorrow will belong to you. In our time, his words are more than history. They are a compass. They remind us that mastery is not limited to the sword nor to the battlefield of old Japan. It is available to anyone who dares to walk the path, to commit fully, to live simply, to act without fear, to train every day with purpose. And so Miyamoto Musashi's story does not end with his death. It lives on in every person who chooses discipline over distraction, courage over fear, substance over comfort. His battles were fought with steel, ours with decisions and distractions, but the core remains the same. To win against the world, you must first win against yourself. This is the eternal legacy of Musashi, the sword saint, proof that the greatest victories are not measured in duels won or enemies defeated, but in the strength of one's own spirit. He walked alone, but his footsteps stretch into eternity, guiding all who wish to live with clarity, purpose, and mastery. The story of Miyamoto Musashi is not just the story of a samurai who lived and died 400 years ago. It is the story of every person who has ever struggled against distraction, fear, or doubt. His life, though forged in steel and blood, carries lessons that resonate in the quiet battles we all face today. Imagine a young entrepreneur standing before investors, uncertain if their idea will be enough. In that moment of pressure, Musashi's teaching whispers across centuries: perceive that which cannot be seen. The outcome cannot be controlled, but the preparation, the mindset, and the ability to adapt, those are the weapons that win the battle before it begins. Picture the artist staring at a blank canvas, paralyzed by the weight of expectation. Musashi would remind them, the way is in training. Put brush to canvas not once but 1,000 times, until the act itself becomes freedom. Mastery is never found in waiting for inspiration. It is earned through daily practice. Consider the modern worker drowning in emails, tasks, and noise. Musashi's words cut through the chaos. Do nothing that is of no use. Focus on what matters most. Strip away the excess. Build clarity in a world designed to scatter attention. And what of relationships of love and loss? Musashi knew attachment could bind a warrior's judgment, cloud the mind, and weaken resolve. His principle, never be saddened by separation, does not mean coldness but resilience. It teaches that we can love deeply without clinging, care sincerely without losing ourselves. In modern life, this wisdom becomes a shield against heartbreak, disappointment, and the endless chase for validation. Even in our age of abundance, Musashi's warnings remain urgent. He rejected luxuries, lived with simplicity, and focused only on what sharpened his spirit. For us, it may mean resisting the constant hunger for more possessions, more approval, more distraction. True strength comes not from accumulation, but from clarity and restraint. And finally, Musashi's acceptance of death his daily reminder that life is fleeting, offers a profound lesson. To live fully is not to avoid mortality, but to embrace it. Knowing that time is limited sharpens each choice. It turns hesitation into action and fear into resolve. Today, this perspective invites us to live with urgency, not wasting hours on trivialities, but devoting ourselves to what matters most. Musashi's closing words in the Dokkōdō were simple: "Do not stray from the way." For him, the way was the lifelong pursuit of discipline, clarity, and mastery. For us, the way may take different forms: raising a family, building a career, creating art, seeking knowledge. The details differ, but the essence remains: walk your path with intention and never abandon it for comfort or fear. As the story of Musashi draws to a close, we are left not with the image of a man wielding a sword, but with the vision of a human being who mastered himself. He won 61 duels, faced armies, wrote masterpieces, and lived without compromise. But his greatest lesson was that the fiercest battle is always within. And so, Musashi's life becomes more than history. It becomes a mirror. It asks each of us, are you walking the path, or are you waiting for the perfect moment that will never come? His answer is clear. Start today. Train today. Live today. The way is in training. The path is in discipline. The victory is in mastery of the self. And when we walk that path, when we refuse to stray from it, then, in some small way, we walk alongside Miyamoto Musashi, the sword saint, whose footsteps echo still, guiding us toward our own quiet victories.